It's 1933. The Great Depression has America by the throat. Unemployment is through the roof. People are losing their homes and banks are collapsing left and right. Franklin D. Roosevelt has just been elected president, promising a new deal to pull the country out of its economic ruin. While ordinary Americans are just trying to survive, some of the country's richest and most powerful businessmen are secretly plotting to overthrow FDR and replace him with a dictator. That actually happened. It's called the business plot, and it's one of the wildest, most under-discussed chapters in American history. So first, let's set the scene. The early 1930s weren't just about financial chaos. They were about political fear. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic collapse. It was a full-blown identity crisis for capitalism itself. Banks had failed. Unemployment was hovering around 25%. People were lining up for bread. Farmers were losing their land. And the old order, the one dominated by big industry and Wall Street, suddenly looked shaky. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took office with his bold New Deal platform. He promised massive government intervention, jobs programs, social safety nets, and new regulations on banks and corporations. To most struggling Americans, that sounded like salvation. But to the ultra-rich and powerful, it sounded like a threat. Many in the business elite were convinced that Roosevelt was secretly a socialist, or even worse, that he was leading the country toward communism. And remember, this is at a time when fascism and authoritarianism were on the rise in Europe. Adolf took power in Germany that very same year. Mussolini had already taken power in Italy. To some American businessmen, those guys looked efficient. They saw Mussolini's Italy as a model of strong leadership, order, and discipline. And they started to wonder, maybe America needed something like that too. A kind of corporate-run government that would keep the radicals and the unions in check. That's where this crazy story begins. Enter Major General Smedley Butler. If you don't know that name, you should. Butler was one of the most decorated Marines in U.S. history, a real war hero. He'd fought in the Philippines, in China, and Central America. He was tough, respected, and patriotic to the core. The kind of guy regular Americans trusted. But what made Butler interesting is that by the 1930s, he'd started speaking out against the very military-industrial system he'd spent his life serving. He famously said, "War is a racket." He believed big corporations and banks used the military to protect their profits overseas, not democracy. So naturally, the elites didn't exactly love him. And that's what makes it so ironic. Because when these businessmen started plotting to overthrow FDR, Butler was the guy they tried to recruit to lead it. Here's how it supposedly went down. In the summer of 1933, Butler was approached by a man named Gerald C. McGuire, a Wall Street broker who claimed to represent a group of powerful businessmen. McGuire told Butler that a group of wealthy industrialists and bankers wanted him to lead a force of 500,000 veterans to march on Washington, D.C. These weren't supposed to be enemy troops. McGuire framed it as a kind of patriotic movement. He said the idea was to protect Roosevelt, because, according to them, the president was under too much pressure from the radicals in his own party. But the real goal? It was to make FDR a puppet dictator. The plotters wanted to create a new position called a Secretary of General Affairs, basically a shadow president who'd control the government while Roosevelt stayed on as a figurehead. Butler didn't buy it. He kept playing along, pretending to be interested, just to see how deep the rabbit hole went. McGuire told Butler that the backers included some of the biggest names in American business, men connected to J.P. Morgan, DuPont, General Motors, and even Goodyear. He mentioned the American Liberty League, a real organization that opposed the New Deal and was funded by the DuPont family, among others. These weren't some fringe radicals. These were the richest, most powerful people in the country. People who had direct influence over banks, media, and manufacturing. And what they wanted was to use Butler's credibility with veterans, especially those from the Bonus Army, who had marched on Washington the year before demanding their military bonuses, to rally support for a coup. They figured Butler could mobilize thousands of desperate, disillusioned veterans, march them into the Capitol and take control, just like Mussolini's march on Rome in 1922. If it worked in Italy, they figured it could work in America too. This is where it gets even more jaw-dropping. Butler went along with the plan just long enough to collect evidence, letters, witnesses, and details. In 1934, he testified before the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, which was basically the forerunner to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Under oath, Butler laid out everything he knew about the plot. The meetings, the money, the promises. He said that McGuire and his associates told him they were ready to spend up to $30 million. That's almost $700 million in today's money, to make this coup happen. They had a whole plan to create a paramilitary organization modeled after European fascist groups. They even had uniforms designed. Butler's testimony was explosive. He named names. He described how these elites wanted to destroy democracy in the name of saving it. And how did the government react? They basically swept it under the rug. The McCormick-Dickstein Committee did investigate. They interviewed witnesses, looked at documents, and even confirmed parts of Butler's story, like the existence of meetings and correspondence. Their final report admitted there was evidence of an attempted coup, but stopped short of prosecuting anyone. No one went to jail. No one was charged. The press mostly downplayed it, treating it like a wild conspiracy theory. Some newspapers even mocked Butler, calling him crazy or gullible. But behind the scenes, the committee's report quietly validated that something shady really had gone down. The plot was real, or at least plans for one were. The only reason it didn't happen was because Butler blew the whistle before it could start. It's not an exaggeration to say that one Marine general might have saved American democracy from an actual fascist coup. Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture, because the business plot wasn't just about a few rich guys scheming. It revealed something deeper about American power and fear during a crisis. The Great Depression had shaken the faith of the rich in democracy. For decades, they'd believed that free markets and minimal government were sacred. Then Franklin Roosevelt came along and said, actually, the government's job is to make sure ordinary people don't starve. To a lot of wealthy industrialists, that sounded like socialism, and they panicked. And when the elite panic, they don't just write angry op-eds. They start thinking about control. The business plot was their fantasy of restoring their order in a country that suddenly seemed to belong to the masses. Sound familiar? Because here's the uncomfortable truth, that fear never really went away. Every time there's a major crisis, whether it's economic collapse, civil unrest, or political polarization, there's always someone out there whispering that democracy is too messy, that we need a strong hand, or that maybe the people can't be trusted with power. The business plot shows us that even in America, the land that prides itself on democracy, the line between freedom and authoritarianism has always been thinner than we like to admit. You might be wondering, what happened to Smedley Butler after all this? He kept speaking out. He kept calling out the military-industrial complex before that term even existed. He toured the country warning Americans about corporate power and endless wars. He died just a few years later in 1940, long before history really gave him the credit he deserved. Today, historians look back and largely agree that Butler told the truth. There really was a conspiracy among some businessmen to overthrow Roosevelt, maybe not a perfectly organized plan, but a serious effort. The only reason we don't talk about it much today is that it's an embarrassing story. It's not comfortable to admit that some of the captains of industry once tried to destroy American democracy. But it happened. And it's worth remembering because the same forces of greed, fear, and elitism that drove the business plot are still around. They just wear nicer suits and have better PR. The business plot is a reminder that democracy doesn't just survive because people believe in it. It survives because people defend it. Smedley Butler didn't have to go to Congress. He could have taken the money, led the coup, or just kept quiet. But he didn't. He stood up to some of the most powerful people in America and said no. That's courage. And it's the kind of courage that history almost forgot to honor. The next time someone tells you that America could never fall to fascism, remember that it almost did. Not because of foreign soldiers or revolutionaries, but because a handful of businessmen thought they knew better than democracy. And the only thing that stopped them was one man willing to tell the truth. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the forgotten history of the business plot, hit that like button, drop a comment about what you think would have happened if Butler hadn't blown the whistle, and subscribe for more stories that connect the dots between history and the world we're living in today. Thanks for watching.